The federal carbon tax is one of the most divisive political issues of the day, on track to dominate perhaps one of the big issues during the fall election campaign. Critics say it will make everything in Canadians' lives more expensive, while proponents insist Canadians will be better off thanks to rebates. Canada's budget watchdog dug into the numbers. So what did he find? Yves Giroux is the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and he joins me now in studio. Hi again. Nice to see you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much for coming in. So we've heard this become a very political debate, and what we've heard from let's start with what we've heard from the Liberals, which is that you will be better off. It's not as though that this carbon tax is going to make families in this country worse off. Because of the rebate, you'll be better off. Can you fact check that statement? I guess, what did you find in your report?
Well, we looked at whether that statement was in fact true, and we looked at income quintiles. So we divided households in 5 equal income groups. So to see whether there was a difference amongst income groups. And we do find that after the rebate, the federal rebate, most households will indeed be better off on average, with the rebate included, of course. The exception is the higher incomes, thank you, households, the top 20% of income earners. So they'll be net contributors to the federal backstop regime in the 4 provinces that are subject to the federal backstop: Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Manitoba.
And why is it? Are they just higher users of those kinds of products?
Indeed, the federal rebate will be equal across income ranges, so it's a fixed per capita amount. But given that higher income households tend to consume more fossil fuels, bigger houses, bigger apartments, more heating oil, gas for heating purposes, more gas purchases, and so on. So their consumption patterns are different. They spend more than they will receive in federal rebates.
You also looked at where the revenue is coming from, and you divided it between the sort of 2 sections of the legislation, one of which applies to everyday Canadians like you and me, and the other one that applies to heavy emitters. And what did you find there?
Well, we find that under the federal regime as it is designed, more than 90% of the revenues or the income generated by the federal pricing system will be coming from the household sector, or will be paid by the households. So 92% based on our estimate, and the remainder will be paid by heavy emitters, big industries.
So why is it that just 8% are paid by heavy emitters? Is that just the way the legislation is written? How does it work?
Well, there is still some level of uncertainty, so that's why we used estimates for that part. But it is the way the legislation is designed so far, and it's meant to be mostly the big emitters, so that leaves out a bunch of sectors, smaller emitters, as well as the agriculture sector. And my speculation as to why a bunch of sectors were left out is to ensure that Canadian businesses and industries are not disadvantaged when it comes to competing on the international stage.
Does it also, though, shift the burden disproportionately to, everyday Canadians versus big companies?
Well, it's clear that everyday Canadians, households, will have to pay more whenever they purchase fossil fuels, gas for the car, obviously, but also indirectly when they buy goods and services for which some energy was required. So they'll have to pay slightly more for everyday goods and services as well.
I was always curious about the way in which those numbers were all calculated, like how much the average family would pay. And I'm wondering if you can sort of give us some insight into that. So, for example, if a store is paying more in their heating costs and they downgrade those costs or pass them on to consumers, is that factored into me being better off at the end of the day?
We did take that into consideration. So we looked at the direct costs using consumption patterns based on Statistics Canada data, also taking into consideration household composition, so different households, different people, different number of persons, children, adults, different consumption patterns, as well as the indirect costs. So we looked at about 100 different sectors using input-output tables. So input-output tables, what comes into the production process, land, energy, raw materials, and what comes out. So we looked at 100 different sectors to see their energy intensity, and we assumed that businesses will not absorb the increased costs stemming from the carbon pricing. They will pass these all to consumers. So We looked at both the direct costs as well as the indirect costs.
Is the conclusion, though, even if they are passed on directly to consumers, that still most families will be better off?
Yes. Even into taking that into consideration, most families will be better off once you take into account the federal rebate.
And what about as the price goes up, because it's a graduated system? We don't know what's going to happen after 2022, but at least for the next 4 years or so.
Well, the government has said that as the price goes up, the entire scheme will remain revenue neutral. So the federal government will return back to households in the provinces where the carbon pricing is generated, will return the entirety of the proceeds. So we have made that assumption. We've assumed that what the government said it would do, it will indeed do, but there's nothing preventing the government in the future from keeping a share of these revenues. We've made the assumption that they will indeed return that and ensure that the revenue that it's revenue neutral.
And you also talked about in the report, just before I let you go, I just want to be clear on it. I know that's focused on the financial aspect of all of this, but you did take into account the likelihood that it will actually reduce carbon emissions, or that carbon emissions in general will go down, and the kind of effect that will have on revenue.
Well, we looked at forecasts from the National Energy Board, especially when it comes to electricity generation. Some provinces, like Saskatchewan, derive, I think, 93% of their electricity from fossil fuels. So the National Energy Board has made projections as to the changing mix of electricity generation, more from non-carbon emitting sources. So we have taken that into consideration, as well as some small behavioral impacts. And that's why the price of carbon goes up by 150% over the period, but the proceeds go up by 136%. The rest is made up of these two impacts.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Giroux. Nice to see you.
My pleasure.
That was Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux, who has crunched the numbers. He says 80% of households in provinces subjected to the federal carbon tax will come out ahead thanks to promised rebates. Will his report on the tax change any minds, and how might it affect the political rhetoric around the carbon tax? Time for the Power Panel. In Calgary, journalist Jen Gerson. Tim Murphy, Managing Director of Macmillan Vantage, is in Toronto. Next to him is Hill and Knowlton Strategies' Melissa Landsman, and former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson, now Chief of Government Relations for University of Toronto. Everyone joins me from Toronto and Calgary. Nice to see you all. Thanks for being with us. Jen, I'm going to start with you. Do you think this report will actually change the political debate at all?
Not really, no. I mean, the Liberals have been saying for a really long time, you know, you're going to be better off with the rebates. It would be surprising to me if the Budget Office came back with a different conclusion. I think that most people who are skeptical of this particular tax are going to look at this and just say, okay, so if I'm getting a rebate and I'm getting more money in my pocket, then what's the point of having the tax in the first place? It doesn't actually disencourage or disincentivize behavior. Of course, economists will come back and say, well, there's substitution effects, and now we're too in the weeds for most political discourse. And I think that the other main piece of skepticism that a lot of people are going to come back at with this is, well, yeah, it makes us better off as long as there continues to be a rebate. However, I mean, even in Alberta, we've seen only a couple of years after the carbon tax was introduced, you know, a lot of the money started to roll back into general revenue. So, you know, maybe we get that rebate for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then after the next election, and people kind of forget about it, then the rebates start to dissipate or disappear. So those are the two pieces of skepticism that I think people who are opposed to the carbon tax are just going to come out with. And as a result, I don't think that this particular report is going to win anybody over.
Melissa, Mr. Giroux was very specific that his report, yes, is predicated on the promise that the money is rebated to Canadians, as the feds have said so far that they'll do, and they say that they will do that in the future. I mean, does that change your mind at all?
Well, I don't think it changes the conversation at all. I think the Liberals are still talking about some magic beans that they're going to give you in terms of a tax, and then they're going to give you the money back. And Conservatives have made this a pocketbook issue. So we're no longer talking about climate change. We're talking about an environmental plan, quote unquote, plan that's a tax. You know, I think Jen's right in saying this. Do revenues continue to come back? Do they continue to tax at the same rate? You know, right now it's $30 a ton. It'll be $50 a ton, and then there's documents that say that it'll be $300 a ton. And this also
the documents don't explicitly say that. They say that that's a consideration if there's no other measures taken.
The government,
the government has yet to say no, that won't happen, or yes, it will.
Right, and the government's own documents, suggest that might be the case. This also just proves that 92% of all of the carbon tax revenue is going to come from ordinary Canadians like you and I, and only 8% are going to come from actual polluters. So what the Liberals have done is they've said you are the polluter, and then you see them giving $12 million back to places like Loblaws, saying, well, here is your break. So that's a tough conversation to have with Canadians, and it also doesn't treat all Canadians. What this report does and what this tax does is it treats all Canadians the same way. So somebody in downtown Toronto who has the means to take transit to offset sort of their carbon footprint. People in PEI and people in rural Ontario and people in rural Saskatchewan, don't have those options. So they're going to be adversely affected, and the report doesn't talk about that at all.
Well, they're going to be rebated, Andrew. To a certain degree, is there any reason to believe that the federal government would renege on that? I believe it's part of the law. Actually, it's not just a promise that they made.
Yeah, I think the bigger problem for them is that there's a huge amount of time from when you get your rebate to when you're noticing that you're paying the tax. So those people who are filing their taxes today will get their rebate in the next couple of weeks, assuming that they don't have tax otherwise owing. But when they are driving to the polls in October and they stop to get gas, they'll notice that the price of gas is a lot higher. And I think that's a real problem for governments. Any governments that have grappled with how to do these kind of rebates through the income tax system always run into this problem that the consumption tax is in your face and the rebate is somewhere hidden back behind a number of other pieces. I think the other problem for the Liberals on this, and I'm sure they're trying to grapple with it now, is, as Melissa has said, that the Conservatives have effectively made this a wedge issue about cost of living and affordability. Assuming they come up with some kind of a passable climate change plan, which we've not seen to date from them, but assuming they come up with something, the problem will be for the Liberals how they continue to remind people that the current plan is actually a better one, two, that it's effective, and I think number three, how they square that with a record that's otherwise somewhat compromised by buying a great big pipeline.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Tim, what do you have to say to that?
Well, look, I think a couple of things. First of all, I'm glad Melissa mentioned PEI, because we see actually today the Premier about to become the Premier, assuming the minority government vote proceeds in the right way, the Conservative leader in PEI, saying he's not joining the four horsemen of the environmental apocalypse of the Tories across this country in their fight against a plan to make polluters pay. So that's some degree of good news. And what you actually see is people on the ground who are actually having to pay the price of climate change are saying we need to act, and that's what this government is trying to do. And let's take what the PBO report actually says, which is that 80% of Canadians are going to be better off by virtue of the transfer of this money. And then let's actually look at what Conservatives are saying they're going to do. Well, you would say maybe we should invest in, in the kinds of programs that can help reduce carbon, like, helping to plant trees. Oh, no, wait a second. We're going to cut our tree planting program. How about investing in things that help the impacts of climate change, like anti-flooding? Oh no, we're going to cut those kind of programs. Well, how about we, work together with industry to help them advance causes that move to make polluters pay? No, we're going to sit in a room and have, smoke cigars and figure out how to cut up the pie so that
Which government are you referring specifically to, Ontario?
Well, we're looking at Andrew Scheer and his gang out in Alberta,
because they're
meeting in the private with various officials in the oil sector to figure out how to make sure we can do things. Well, no, I don't think so, because we see actually what we've got is an alliance between Jason Kenney and Doug Ford and Andrew Scheer. And what are they actually doing, in fact? Cutting school lunches, not taking any action on climate change at all, in fact, actively cutting programs that help in the environment.
I think they would.
Kenney actually has introduced a climate change plan. We can argue about the specifics of the climate change plan.
It's a joke. He actually quotes. So we've made 22% reduction in emissions. You know who that was? That was the Liberal government getting rid of coal plants.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I would
Jason
forward
Kenney.
you over to Andrew Leach, who actually created the climate change plan for the NDP. He actually did a really excellent analysis on a comparison to the Kenney plan versus the Notley plan. And I would argue it's not as good as the Kenney plan from a pure emissions point of view, and it definitely puts more onus, but it does put more onus on polluters in certain ways than it does on individuals. It's a different strategy. It's probably not as stringent, but there isn't no plan in place. So I think that it's important to be accurate on that front.
So this is a really important point, though. If the Conservatives do not come out with some kind of a plan in the next several months, I think they are going to have some real difficulties. And we're even seeing today here in Ontario that the type of overreach that the government is suffering from in terms of hyping the fear around the carbon tax, their decision to put stickers on all the gas pumps, has drawn the ire of all people, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, who have now asked them to cut that back because they've said that it's simply overly partisan and infringes on businesses' rights to run their own business. So this is a tough file. I think people, especially across the country, do want to see some action on climate, but they also want to make sure that the solutions that are coming forward are actually going to have some meaningful impact.
I think that's a valid discussion to have, because I think that there are different plans being put forward. We see a sort of dividing line, right? Like there's the Liberals who are saying, and other provinces who use this as well, who say that a carbon tax will be the most effective way in concert with a number of other measures. There are other, like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford, and I imagine the federal Conservatives will come out with something similar, which say we're going to tax the heavy emitters, but it won't be on the consumption side of things. And I guess at this point, it's hard to see. It's hard to. I mean, there are lots of bigger experts out there who evaluate what is most effective, but the proof isn't in the pudding yet. We're still way off, no matter what anyone says, those targets that we've set for 2030.
Oh.
Yeah, look, I think it's hard to argue that a tax plan is actually an environmental plan, and I think we've said that a lot, and I think that's what Canadians across the country, and that's the reason they voted in Doug Ford and Jason Kenney, and they've ran on an opposition to the carbon tax. I think when you're calling 92% of people in the plan, regular people like you and I who drive, the polluters, and you're taxing 8% of the actual heavy emitters, I think people are going to have a very big problem with that. And I don't think that the Conservative plan, once it comes out, and I understand that it'll come out well before the next election, and if
only they tell us when.
if it turns the table on that, and it actually taxes heavy emitters, and not everyday sort of ordinary Canadians, I think that's something that the Liberals are going to have to compete with.
Quick final word to you, Tim, on this segment.
Well, I look forward to the plan. I think we've been waiting for more than a year when it was promised imminently. Let me guess, it'll say we're going to invest in technology. We're going to, put a price on certain kind of things, but we may have to exempt the oil sands and a few other things. So, I'll wait and see. At the end of the day, I think, this is a debate that there's a certain degree to which this is an existential debate. When you look at kind of the flooding, the climate change problems that we're all experiencing on every day, we actually have to decide whether we need to act. And I think there is a growing realization that we need to act. And there may be a little bit of a demographic split in that, but I think the need to act is compelling. There can be a legitimate debate about the degree of action and the methodology of acting. But I think what we're seeing is a conservative movement that's really pretending to act while just using it as a political tool to try and get themselves elected, while facing, I think, a real existential problem in climate and not doing anything about it.
All right. Well, I imagine the debate around that and whether anyone's doing anything or nothing or whatever is going to continue for a long time.